Hello, happy Monday. My name is Eric Miller, and welcome to another CE National Digital Lab. I have some friends with me today. My beautiful wife, Bethany, is actually joining me on the call today. We have our friends Eric and Vanessa Smith. They live in Lanham, Maryland. And we're pumped that you would join us for this digital lab, whether you're live with us on Zoom or whether you're joining us on Facebook Live. Thank you. Hello. Welcome to a digital lab. This conversation today, we want to talk about singleness and dating. These digital labs exist. We've been doing these for a while now, but they exist to help equip churches, to help equip pastors, youth pastors, ministry teams, church staff, even families to better be equipped in a specific area or topic. And today we're going to talk about singleness in dating in ministry. And so maybe you're single and on a church staff. Maybe you're dating and you're not quite yet married and on a church staff, or maybe you're single and hoping to date somebody soon. This is probably not going to be very helpful in tips or tricks in that regard, but we wanted to talk to you today we want to bring you some encouragement. And really, the more realistic thing is maybe you're watching this video and you have somebody that is in your church that's single and longing to date and be married. And so we want to help you understand how you can encourage that person. And so thank you for joining us today for this conversation. This is my beautiful wife, Bethany. We actually met online, and so we'll talk about that through the course of this conversation. It was a comedy of errors and proof that there is a God, the fact that we are married, and that Bethany saw it through the whole way, because there were many opportunities for her to leave. So thank you for that. Thank you, God, for that. Eric and Vanessa have a fun story in how they met. Vanessa is the principal at the Lanham Grace Church, or at the school, K through 12 high school there at Lanham, and Eric is the youth pastor, discipleship pastor. I know you wear a lot of hats. He kind of does it all. So thank you guys for joining us. Why don't you two just tell us a little bit about how you guys met and kind of the dynamics in the relationship at the time when you guys both started being employed by really the same organization.
Well, Eric came in for an interview and I was like, man, no, I'm just kidding. That's not how.
That technically I did the first time we met. Well, I may have been given a tour before it, but we did first meet. I was in an interview when I came on at the church. I was part-time at the church, and I was going to teach some classes at the school as well. And it's kind of separate, and they wanted to, the church interviewed me, the school didn't interview me. They wanted to meet me to make sure, whatever. And so the first time I met Vanessa wasn't an interview to teach PE, that we had a real conversation.
I don't remember. I honestly don't.
Perfect.
And then I think we kind of had a very, I would say, professional relationship, really not much of a relationship at all for a year, or so, because we worked for each other, we didn't see each other. I wasn't a full-time teacher. So even though she was my boss, she wasn't really my boss in that sense. And then we kind of mutually started hanging out. It's actually kind of funny how I could go into a real funny story about this, how it worked out. But one day I was sitting outside, sad and lonely, and her and a couple friends were going to go out to eat. I think it was my birthday, and I was working that day late. And so they invited me out to have dinner with them that evening, and me and Vanessa sat next to each other and started hitting it off. And out of that, it took a couple more months. We were just hanging out together with friends, and kind of started to see, figuring out that this was going to be something more than just a friendship. Do you have something you think about it? Vanessa has more of the story than I do.
No, I mean, yeah, we just were hanging out mutually as friends. And then Eric was in the Guard at the time, the National Guard. And so he was leaving for some month-long training. And I was heavily involved in ministry at my church. And so I did a month of camp. So we were both kind of going our separate ways for the summer. And he asked me out before I left, which was to play baseball
On the
video
PlayStation.
On the
On
PlayStation. And I
yeah.
remember calling my friend and being like, he just asked me to play baseball. Like, what does this mean? And
that's the first time we hung out together, like by ourselves.
Just together, yeah.
It was kind of like our first, I guess you'd call it a date. It wasn't really a date. We might have had dinner too. I don't know.
Not together. And then we were gone. We didn't see each other. So we were texting back and forth for that month. And I was just really curious to see whether or not, how quickly he followed up, like when we got back. And he did pretty quickly. And so we went out on our first official date and then, started dating from there.
Fun. Very fun. I think Bethany would probably still say she's my boss, even though we're not.
I would say that about Eric too.
There you go.
He's also an elder at the church, which technically like trumps my position at the school. So he quickly reminds me that he is actually my boss.
After we got married last year, I told the students, which I've received several complaints from, I said, listen, even though, who's the boss? And they'd say, oh, Mrs. Smith. I said, yeah, but guess who Mrs. Smith's husband is? I'd be like, I'm the boss, really.
So fun.
I don't think she really appreciated it, but.
Yeah, so fun. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being a part of this call. Now, I think I just heard you say, you just remind everybody that's watching, how long have you guys been married, and kind of give the context of how long were you both in your role at the church and with the school before you even got married?
So I've been with the school for 13 years. And then he had come on board.
Yeah, well, I was at the school
probably like 10 years when we started. I guess it's been about 13 now,
yeah.
But back then it was probably 10.
So I was at the church for maybe a year, I don't know the exact time frame, maybe a year and a half, somewhere about there, before we started dating. We've been married now for a year and a couple months. So I think we dated for
about a year and a half. And then we were engaged for about 6 months.
Okay, yeah.
We got engaged in December, married by June.
Yeah, so we did date for quite a while in there in between.
Yeah. So yeah, that's exactly why I asked that, because that, for our viewers, that's a good chunk of time to be, one, single and in ministry, and two, to be dating and kind of living in that fishbowl. So that's important context. On our side, I had been the youth pastor in Frederick, Maryland, just up the road from you guys in Lanham, for 10 years before I had even met Bethany. And I kind of I had a roommate at the time who was big into online dating. And as a youth pastor, I was super uncomfortable with that. I thought, this is sketchy. Like, it wasn't Tinder or anything like that. But there's like a Christian dating site, right? Everybody always, I know that's the thought that they think.
We're not encouraging.
We're not encouraging. And honestly, I don't even know, to this day, I don't even know that I would encourage Christian dating sites. Everybody's different, and you have to pray that through, and it's something that you really have to consider. So please don't hear me endorsing that. I'm just saying it's part of our story. So my roommate at the time was big into online dating. He was on multiple sites at the time. I was kind of like, you're the reason I don't want to do this. But I went to speak at a camp in Pennsylvania, and he set me up online without me knowing it. And so we actually agreed that I would do the 10-day free trial, and then we would never speak of that again. So we put some things in place, and lo and behold, just briefly, in those 10 days, I met Bethany. A hilarious story of some of the logistics and details of how that played out, but which we don't have time for in this conversation, and that's not even the point. But it was unbelievable in that, like, then as we're trying to get to know each other, for me as a pastor, as a youth pastor even, I have all these thoughts running through my head, like, is this allowed? Is this okay? Like, I didn't want to tell my students that I met this girl online. Like, I didn't want, like, my 16-year-olds going home telling their parents, like, hey, our youth pastor met this girl online, and now she's coming to visit him. And like,
well, and to add to that too, I think, is to understand that I was living in New York at the time. And so we also had a long distance component. And so when we got together, it wasn't like we went out to dinner. It was like somebody had to come stay for a weekend. And so part of that was we did have to engage other friends in that knowing what was going on, because we stayed in each other's friends' houses. So, in fact, we are still dear friends with the first people that I stayed with the first time I came to Maryland to visit Eric. And likewise, I had friends in New York who then would host him when he'd come up for a weekend. But so then it was kind of like, well, anything you were doing that weekend, which in ministry, you certainly have weekend responsibilities and engagements, then especially when I came to visit, I was coming along to. So very early on in the relationship. So it wasn't like I could just kind of stay out of it for a while. And so the first time that I came down to visit and went to church with Eric that weekend, and it was like maybe 2 or 3 people who knew who I was and why I was there. And instead I was part of a church plant in New York at the time. And I think that's another layer too to add in, is that I was not in ministry. I mean, I was a volunteer and a lay person, deeply involved in my church plant, but not, I wasn't holding a full-time ministry role. So I came down to visit. So Eric introduced me to people as, oh, this is a friend of mine, Bethany. She's part of a church plant in New York. And,
it's very safe answer.
And so really made it seem like, oh, it's a ministry connection who's just passing through, and kind of didn't give any indication that it was anything more than that. But then I think it was less than a month later that I came back for a second visit, and boy, by within just a few weeks, and then it was kind of we went to a community event that the church had a booth at, and I remember being there and kind of seeing people and kind of standing back, but definitely watching me and with this little grin on their face. And it was kind of, yes, hi. So that was kind of a whole other fishbowl experience that I think might be different than the rest of you, of coming into a church and by way of dating the pastor. Let me tell you, and especially then once I moved to Maryland, boy, everybody knew who I was. So,
whether you knew them or not.
Yeah. We've got great stories of people stopping me in the grocery store. Hi, how are you? And I'm like, I'm going to assume you're from church.
So a question that I have for you guys, and this was not the case for me, but were there any requirements or guidelines even or conversations maybe in terms of when you started as a single person in your role, of guidelines or boundaries in dating, or Eric, maybe for you working more directly with the youth, was anything like that in place? Would that have been helpful? Would that have been a hindrance? Talk about that a little bit.
There was nothing in place. Maybe there was there was no official thing written down or anything like that. I don't remember if there were any conversations or maybe things, but I don't remember any boundaries or guidelines. I think it's hard for me to say what it would be helpful. I don't know what I mean? Because I can't see what those guidelines would have been. I feel like, overall we handle it pretty well. So I'm happy with how things worked out, but I think had it not gone well, had it been a disaster, I probably would think that guidelines would be very helpful. And I think if I was on the flip side, I might have some guidelines for somebody.
Right.
But there certainly weren't any guidelines for me.
Yeah. Vanessa, anything for you?
Don't date the dads. I think that's it's kind of for school. There's certain protocol there that's kind of already in place.
Did they really say don't date?
No, I think no. But I think they're just certain professional guidelines, being in education, that you kind of, whether directly or indirectly, address and talk about in terms of professionalism. And I don't think that changed. But there really wasn't anything in terms of not dating other coworkers or anything like that. That was never in place. But I think as a teacher and then as an administrator, just kind of maintaining a level of professionalism was kind of always discussed, and something that we discuss with our teachers even now.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I think part of the reason I'm asking that is because, coming into a staff where I was right out of college, Eric, I know you were shortly out of college. You had done, I think, a few other things, but the idea is really like in that context, like oftentimes churches hire youth pastors or children's directors or worship leaders or people right out of college, and they may very well be single. And that's totally fine. We love that. We support that, right? But for a church to just kind of think through, like, how do we help this person be successful? Because there is an added layer of complication to this if they're looking to date and begin, have a family, and it's not even like to like put obstacles in their place, but really to help them be successful and to guard them. Like, Eric, I think you're exactly right where you said, like, if it had been a train wreck, well, the reality is, if you're dating, let's say if you're dating the principal and it's a train wreck, well, and it doesn't work out, well, the church probably just lost their youth pastor, right? Like, and honestly, even for me, like, I had some difficult dating circumstances and times where my dating history didn't go well. I'm not pleased with how it went, and yet nobody walked alongside of me to have those conversations in a healthy biblical community where I felt like I had somebody that I could process that with. And really for me, what it did is it caused me to hide things that I shouldn't have hid, that I should have been forefront, that I should have said, hey, this is what's going on, or I have a question about this. It created a culture where I decided that I needed to be secretive about things because I was ashamed. And the enemy used that in some ways. So I think for churches just to be wide-eyed, open about that, begin those conversations and be open to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess even as I'm thinking about that, because I've kind of now, again, I haven't ever been in a full-time ministry role other than as a pastor's wife, but I've always worked kind of in business and more in the business world and nonprofit. And so certainly there's HR roles and things like that. And I don't really know that that's so much what would be most helpful. I think those are important for the organization and may be important for protecting the organization. But I think as we're talking about this, I feel like instead of it just being like written rules or guidelines, I think more valuable is there room for just open and honest conversation about it? And maybe that's in a discipling relationship. Maybe that's in a small group setting. Maybe that's, more of a relational setting. But are there people in the church who may be older, wiser, more experienced, have been through this before, whatnot, who are willing to engage in those uncomfortable conversations and say, look, you're a single person, and not with any expectations upon them, but like, hey, I'm like, as you navigate that, I want to be here for you. I want to have those conversations, so whether you're dating someone or wishing you were dating someone or not, if you want to talk through that and how you can best do that, please let me walk alongside you, even if it's not to say, hey, I have all the answers, but just, I want to be a resource and a support. And let's face it, I mean, since we've all been in dating relationships, we can lose our heads a little bit. So, I know, and I will say in my young 20s, I was not walking with the Lord and had a lot of really unhealthy dating scenarios come up. But when I re-engaged my faith and certainly even being in my church plant, I had some really key friends who were very open to having those conversations with me and having the people who are willing to hold up the mirror and ask some very important questions. That was very helpful. And again, not that it was like, here are the rules, but hey, let's talk about this and let's talk about it in relationship to your relationship with God, to your self-respect, to your personal goals, to, all of those things, and have someone to engage in that with. So.
Yeah. And I would agree with that 100%. I think as people in the ministry, people in the church, I think there's already a level of rules that you expect that somebody that's in the ministry kind of already has for themselves, has for other people that they're engaging with, things, do's and don'ts. I mean, some of these things, having waited a long time to date or whatever, you kind of already know what those things are. So I think setting up some specific rules and stuff, I think to some degree is redundant, because you assume that those are already in place when you hire a youth pastor or a pastor or whatever, and that they're going to hold themselves to those standards. But having a couple or people in the church that you can really partner with, that's going to ask the tough questions, or that's, helping you to be accountable, I think is more important than necessarily just don't do this, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for us, as churches, to put those things into our policies when we're hiring somebody who's single. But Vanessa, I think you just said it beautifully. To understand, if you're hiring a single person, to ask them genuinely, hey, is it your desire to get married? Are you actively dating somebody? And how can we help support you in that? Mm-hmm. How can we help protect you in that? Maybe, it's the lead pastor or the other people on staff saying, hey, we want to be sensitive to that. And if that means a certain, set of procedures or conversations that we can have to encourage you in that, then we want to be mindful of that. Yeah. So let's kind of go in a different direction here. I know we all have had, when we were single and even while we were dating, people maybe make comments that they love you, they want to be helpful.
It comes from a very good place.
Yeah, it comes from a good place, but maybe they're not actually helpful comments. Maybe they're actually very rude, or they're not considerate. I know for us, having been in that context, we can probably think of some of those and we understand them. But I think if you're, somebody that's maybe watching this video and this conversation, they may not be aware of those things. So let's kind of talk about that, just for the sake of helping shed a light on it, for people who genuinely mean well. But what would be some of those comments that maybe you guys have received, or even a mindset that's not helpful in that?
I was before, not at the church, now, I probably have less stories, but there was one particular family that, in the last church I was at, I was a youth intern there, or I don't even know what my title was, but, I wasn't a full-time youth pastor, but they had a family member. One of our leaders in our church had a family member that they wanted me to date. And so they kind of pushed it onto me, and they got me to take her, and even their child who was in the youth group was like a part of the process. So, they kept, kind of badgering me with this individual. They gave me her phone number. They're showing me pictures of her, getting me to date her. And I did talk to the girl for a little bit, and I wasn't interested in dating her. And for me, the big problem with that is I don't necessarily know if it's a bad idea that they suggested somebody, but the fact that after I said no, they kept, kind of trying to make, and it becomes awkward then, because you got, I don't want to be I don't like this person, I don't want to date them, whatever. They were just kept it going, and that was sort of problematic to me at that time.
I think out of the goodness of people's hearts, sometimes they feel like marriage, or we as a church, I think we celebrate marriage as this goal to be attained, that there's this incompleteness if you're not married or in a relationship or whatever it is. And so I think, again, coming from a very good place, people are very invested in you being happy, just like they're happy, and being in a relationship, because I think it's something that we just push. I would say as a female, I obviously I don't know what it's like to be a guy, but I know that I felt the stress a lot, because it's this constant, I know somebody, here I am, accomplishing a lot of other things in my life, the principal of a school, getting my master's degree, all of these different things that I feel like I accomplished, but kind of none of it mattered. I mean, I know people were excited about it, but marriage was this ultimate goal. And to some degree, to a place where the spiritual condition of a person didn't matter. A lot of these facts, compatibility didn't really matter. It was just kind of there's a single person, you guys should get together. And so it can be very discouraging, because if that's something that you really want, is to be in a relationship or to be married, it can be discouraging to be constantly like having to address that, and to be telling people no, or whatever the situation is. But it's also, you know, it does like play on your feelings, your self-esteem, like all of those things. I would just say leave people alone. Like if they're single and they approach you and say, hey, do you know somebody? Then by all means engage. But if you don't, just leave them alone. I think that it's okay that people are single. It's, you know, people walk their own individual paths, and they meet people in a variety of different ways. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's probably not for their lack of trying. And so unless somebody's approaching you and saying, can you help me? Like, please don't. I don't know. Maybe that's harsh, but that's how I feel about it.
No, I think that's true. And I think even I remember not all that long ago, when we were still in Maryland, we would have once a week some young adults at our house, and it was not a small group, not an agenda, but literally just a hangout. And so
We wanted to be a safe place for people to come. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say, and through no setting up of our own, there is a married couple that came out of that group. but that was like, they figured that out all on their own. We did not.
We prayed for them faithfully. We did. We prayed for them.
Yeah.
But we didn't interject. Yeah.
But by the same token, I recall one of the young men saying one time that there was a group of 3 or 4, I think, young men from the church who were saying that there's one particular person who has approached all of them at some point or another with, wouldn't this person be great? Wouldn't that person be great? And I think even at times, because you're dealing with 2 different people, and so 2 different people who may be in different places, and by the way some of the things were approached, sometimes getting one person's hopes up when the other person wasn't there. And so creating, you know, and again, I truly believe the heart of the person who was trying to work some of these things out for them was genuine and was loving, and yet didn't see the ramifications of the awkwardness and the difficulties and even hurt feelings that came out of that. And so I think that was really challenging for them. And so, yeah, wanting to be sure. And I think, you know, Vanessa, to your point of understanding that someone may not want your help, and that's okay, and that they are okay. And I think even I had somebody say to me when Eric and I were dating, I think it was right after I'd moved to Maryland, because we then faced I moved to Maryland, and then everybody started asking when we were getting engaged, because I moved down before we got engaged, and we purposefully wanted to live in the same town and date normally for a little bit before we did that. And so, but we had a lot of people asking, which then became a whole other added pressure. And I remember somebody very wisely saying to me, look, people will say those things and people will talk, and you kind of have to put up a wall to it, because, you know, it's always the next question. And so when we're single, it's, are you dating somebody? Once you're dating, it's, when are you getting engaged? Once you get married, when are you having a baby?
Yep.
And then once you have a baby, when are you having another one?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now that we have 2, I get people who are asking if we're having a third. So I mean, it just does. And again, I think it's people who are, I want to be clear, and I want to be gentle even with people who are engaging in those questions. I don't want them to feel bad for their interest and their love and their desire for us to see some of God's blessings in those ways. But I think we also have to understand that and trust that what we proclaim, that God has a plan for each of us, and He has a perfect timing for each of us, and that now may not be His timing. And so for those of us, and I'm saying us, even though we're not in that boat anymore, but like for those who are single and dating, what they really need to be seeking is God and His perfect timing, and they are whole in that. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, and then trusting that God will bring those blessings in His perfect timing. And, you know, Eric and I have talked, if we had met in our young 20s, we would not be having this conversation today. And so, you know, that's a beautiful thing, that God while neither of us in our young 20s thought it was a beautiful thing that we were not yet married, we now know God was refining us, and God was taking us from places where we were and growing us to a place where we could then enter into this and be successful in it. Again, not that I never want to say that it's easy. We've had our own challenges, but could we have gone through those where we were before? So we don't know the path that somebody else is on and what journey they're on with God. And so we need to be careful about interjecting what we think is right for their lives, especially if it's somebody you don't know particularly well and aren't engaged with in that kind of intimate conversation.
And I do want to say too, I think there's wholeness in singleness. It's not a brokenness. There's wholeness, and there's a lot of great opportunity to do ministry and to, like, my time was my own when I was single. I could do whatever I wanted for as long as I wanted. I could do, if I wanted to do, go for a month to do camps, I could do that. And that I don't have that opportunity. And so I think it's a great thing to be single. It's a great thing to be married. I think both of them are equally great. And I think that that's important sometimes for us to kind of stress as a church too, is that there's nothing wrong with you because you're single or haven't found that person.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, I think, as churches, we have to be careful. Is the message that we're portraying onto these people who are single or dating, like, hey, we really want this to work out because you're not okay until you're married.
Mm-hmm.
And that may not be what we're saying, but it may be how they feel. And so if, even in some of our smaller churches, if a church hires an Eric Smith and he's a phenomenal youth pastor, well, if it doesn't work out in a dating relationship and you like him, well, now maybe you lose him or even within your small groups, or, if you've only got a few single people and you keep trying to set them up, one of them might leave because it's awkward and uncomfortable and you're creating a context that's difficult.
In our church, that was one of the things. So we had in our young adult group, thinking about that, I was very cautious because we had two young adults that dated or sort of dated and didn't work out. One of them was extremely hurt, and one of them left. And the last time we had a guy a little while, maybe a year ago now, that was in our he had asked me, he said, hey, I'm thinking about asking so-and-so out. Should I? And I was like, please don't. I'm like, I know this person, this won't work out. And I'm like, this is going to create a lot of conflict. And I'm like, if you do, please be very cautious. And like, because it does, it can really be devastating, especially depending on the emotional maturity of people and how it creates an awkwardness. And in a church like ours or in a small group, it really can break up the dynamic. The one relationship I'm thinking about, it broke up the dynamic of the small group that we had there. And it can really change things.
Yeah. The last thing I think, I want to make mention of it, and we talked about this even before we started our call here today, is like to understand, like, yes, people's hearts are in the right place, but to support them, to encourage them, really the best thing you can do is pray for them. And Vanessa, you said it, have those conversations with them where you're truly getting to know what are the things that they're looking for. And if that's your desire to set them up so that they'll be married and whole or whatever, well, then your heart's probably not in the right place. And so I know for the 10 years, I had people trying to set me up. The funniest one was, a lady who had said, I found the perfect person for you. And she had done this a couple of times. And I said, okay, I'll bite, because they were kind of always very off the wall ideas. And she finally said, like, it's the cashier at our grocery store. And I was like, so she's good at her job? Like, she was like, she's friendly, she's beautiful, she like remembers my name. And I'm like, you paid with a credit card. Like, so,
you can pack your groceries.
Yeah, she was very service oriented. But do you know, like, does she love Jesus? Do you even know, like, the things that I'm looking for in a relationship? And is that helpful? Because if not, like, I don't even want to engage in the conversation with you because of past times where you've tried to do that. So to really, like, we have a friend who does this well, And he's been successful in matchmaking lots of couples, but I think it's because he's so intentional at really getting to know them. And like, hey, what are you honestly looking for? What are your top things? Like, what have you found that you didn't like? And having a legitimate conversation about it. So with all that being said, let's kind of flip the coin to the other side. What things were helpful for you guys in your singleness, or when you started dating? Maybe people that influenced you, that encouraged and supported you.
I have a great couple that connected with me at my old church. They're the youth pastor and his wife there, and just kind of allowed me to be a third wheel at almost everything that they did, at every family event. And they're still dear friends of ours. And that was hugely impactful in my life. It kept me busy. It kept me, with something to do. They supported my dating, but didn't pressure me at all to do anything. They were just there. And so that was hugely, that was a big benefit in my life through my single years. And then when we were dating, we had a couple that we kind of connected with regularly, and still do. So that was huge for me.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm going to jump in there and say I was very fortunate to have some of those relationships as well when I was in New York. And I had mentioned that I was part of a church plant. There were a number of really supportive people, but I think of 3 couples in particular that I was really tight with. And one of them, I used to go to their house every Sunday night. And, their kids, you can't tell me that's not my niece and nephew. Like, can't tell my heart that, like, we might not be blood related, but, we were really tight. And it was the same thing. I got invited to a lot of things. And I lived in an area where I didn't have family too. So they really did become family. And so them and the other couples there who were in varying stages of life, they were family, and we got together on holidays and weekends and different things. And they were people who invested in my life and who cared about me. And I love how you said that, Vanessa. They asked questions about my dating life, and they were available for those conversations and interested without giving me any kind of agenda. And it gave me a safe place to go and have those conversations. And I actually, as we were preparing for this call, I had remembered, I hadn't thought about it in a long time, when we were very first starting our church plant, we had gotten together for a prayer night, and we had broken up just into really small groups. And I think there were 3 of us in our group praying together and praying for each other and the church and different, and kind of just wherever the Spirit led. And I remember in the middle of it, the gentleman who was the pastor at our church at the time, or of what was becoming our church, stopped in the middle of it and said, Beth, do you mind if I pray for your future husband? He goes, I don't know why, I just kind of got this prompting, and I'd like to do that if it's okay with you. And looking back on that, I love that he asked permission. And then, I gave permission, and then he proceeded to pray for, now we know it was Eric. Didn't know at the time. But, looking back on that, I don't remember everything he said, but I remember it really was about looking for God's perfect timing, about God blessing that person wherever they may be, and about God working in our lives so that we would be ready for each other when that time came. So none of it was like, God bring them a spouse or, any of that. And in some ways it was very comforting to be able to just rest in that place of saying, that, if that's God's will, then that person is out there, and we're going to entrust that to God. And that was a really awesome sense of support and encouragement for me as a person and my whole journey. So I think that's a really awesome example that I received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eric, anything for you?
I think when we were dating, one thing that was helpful and probably completely different than some of my previous relationships before Vanessa is that we hung out with, and some of the same people she mentioned while she was single, we hung out with like a group of people that were married. Whereas when I was in college or wherever else, it was like a bunch of single dudes, and a couple of single people. But it's a different dynamic when you're meeting each other with strong Christians who are married, who kind of give you a better context of what a real relationship is like, rather than a bunch of guys who are just doing whatever and bouncing off the walls, and who knows what direction. My single friends would give me advice like, how do these people even know, what they're talking about, or like, and I think that kind of helped grounded our relationship. It kept it a lot more, put boundaries on it, made it a lot safer. And I think that was a really helpful thing. And they were all strong Christian families too, so I think that was very helpful.
Yeah, so I think as we look at the fact that the four of us kind of ran that gauntlet of being single in ministry for an extended period of time, being frustrated and feeling like I'm speaking for myself here, but there were definitely times where I felt like God, are you not listening? Like the cry of my heart is to be married and to have a family, and my college buddies were all getting married and having kids, and they were starting to go into middle school, and I'm realizing the kids that are in my middle school are could like it's hard. It's hard, and then the fact of dating in ministry, and that was a whole nother level of living in the fishbowl, and the stress of that, and like, what if this doesn't work out, and the pressure that gets put on that. Like, as you guys reflect on that and think about it, what are the things that you would encourage our viewers who are single and dating or longing to date? How would you encourage them? What things would you say that maybe would help support them or frame it appropriately?
Is the question for those who are single looking to date?
Yeah, or single and dating. Like, how do they keep going in that?
Well, I think if someone's the key is to have your heart and your focus on God. Even when you start dating, it's easy to sort of I mean, we all know stories of people who, because of relationships, have walked away from the Lord, and who get dissatisfied with their life because they don't have a relationship. And so I think that focus is really important to keep. I think even when we dated, by the time we got, we dated for a while, in part because and both of us wanted to be so cautious. We didn't want a relationship to destroy the work that we were doing for God, and the ministry that we had. And, at that point in my life, I think my life, and I think same thing with Vanessa. I mean, we were focused on serving God. That was our focus, and dating was kind of, I think, really a secondary thing at that point. And so we dated for a while, sort of not dating. Like we just said, we're going to be friends. We were dating. Looking back now, it was dating, but we kind of had this mindset, well, if we decide that we don't want to, we just want to be friends. We didn't want to walk out of this, for a couple, maybe a month or two.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about in a fishbowl, he lives in one of the parsonage houses. The school is here. Everything is here. The church is here. I remember leaving his house one day to come over. It was on a Saturday afternoon, and coming over to get something from the school. And I ran into one of the church ladies, and I remember running back into the house, they know.
Yeah.
They saw me.
Her eyes were probably like,
And so in a lot of ways, the epitome of that fishbowl, we walked through that just because he's here. And so I think I was very honest with one of the elders at the church is also my boss. He's the director at our school. And so I went to him very early on, and I was like, we're not dating, but we are seeing each other. We're talking. I didn't even know how to really explain it. I'm trying to use words that make sense, that would make sense to him. But the reality is, you're going to see my car parked outside of this house, and I don't want that to be a question. I need you to know that we're talking. And as that started to progress, just kind of keeping somebody in leadership in the loop, so that, again, if something, I didn't want them to be surprised. For my role at the school, I didn't want there to be any surprises in terms of what's going on. And I know there were business meetings and stuff where people were asking you when are you getting engaged? Are you engaged yet? What's going on? It's been, and so, but I think either one or two. I think having a good support system around you at the church of people that know you, that know the boundaries that you're setting, that know you guys individually and then you guys collectively, so that if people say anything, or as those things I think inevitably come, we had a situation where somebody wrote a letter just about me leaving, which never happened, but it was like this very I was very concerned.
Someone wrote an anonymous letter to the head of the school and said that they had seen Vanessa leaving my house numerous times late at night, wearing, what was the? Disgusting shorts. Very nasty letter, and basically accusing us like she was living at my house. So that, and it's funny thinking about letting people know, because if it would have been me, I think I would have kept things kind of secret. I was so cautious. I would have probably kept things secret. I think Vanessa right away kind of went, which he also, the gentleman she told is also a leader in our church. So that became public knowledge then. If that wasn't the case though, I think that event could have been really bad.
Right. And I think in the midst of that situation, like nobody paid any mind to it because I was very concerned. I was like, my reputation, oh my gosh, like we're doing everything right. He had a roommate, it was just, there was nothing there, but I was just like, oh my gosh, this is devastating. He laughs it off. He's like, this is ridiculous. The person who wrote the letter didn't realize I had a roommate. So they and who was also a person in our church, they didn't realize that. So they wrote this letter about how Vanessa's like living with me, not knowing that there's a man that lives at my house, another man. Like it was so ridiculous.
Yeah.
And through that though, I think he was very supportive and like, this is ridiculous. But the elders were too. I mean, they were very dismissive of it because they knew us individually and they knew our situation, and there wasn't anything that, it was just, we were kind of open about, with selective people, right? Not letting everybody in, but kind of being open with the people we should have been open with. And so when situations like that come, they weren't blindsided by anything. But that also doesn't mean that we were like open with everybody in the community at large. We, especially with the school and all of the students, we didn't formally announce that we were dating or really do anything together as a school activity.
When we got engaged, some kids were like, what? Oh my goodness. Some of the students were like, there was like a shock coming upon them.
But so I think that's helped, keep people informed of what's going on. I think accountability is,
I think boundaries too for us. Boundaries were a big thing. Like Vanessa, so I live at the parsonage here, and people were at my house all the time, especially when I was single, all the time people were there. I had a roommate there, people were coming in and out. Vanessa was there a lot, but for us, Vanessa, I don't think she was in my bedroom until the week before we got married. And only that was only because we had to move the bed. We had to move stuff in. She was never in my bedroom. And I have a roommate there. So we had very clear, I don't think we hung out a whole lot by ourselves, other than when we go to maybe the movies or out to eat. But we were not sitting at my home alone. We were not, so we had some pretty, and I don't even know if we necessarily.
Well, even if we were, there was somebody that had a key and we never knew when they were coming in. And even in terms of the church, the church parking lot's right there. So I think.
Vanessa always. And I also think too, you always left at a certain time. She never probably stayed beyond 9 or 10. There were some boundaries. Some of that wasn't stuff that we did intentionally, but I thank God for Steve, my roommate, who lived with me, because he was there. There's no temptation when Steve's sitting next to you on the couch, and that's something looking back that if I didn't have Steve as my roommate, I would have had to really think through some of those things a little bit more. Having Vanessa at my house over would have been a problem, I think.
And these were things that we also kind of embraced, and we I don't know that we ever necessarily formally talked about those things together. I think we were both kind of coming from a similar place, so that worked for us. But I think if there's unsurety, you should probably have those conversations of where are those guidelines, where are those boundaries, what safety measures, again, accountability do you need to have in place, and not despise those things, but kind of embrace them. Because at the end of the day, they are going to help you stay safer, even if things implode. Like, let's say things don't work out, you want to make sure that at the end of the day, your ministry is protected and the work of the Lord can move forward with as little hindrance as possible. And so the more you can safeguard that, the better it is.
Yeah. And I really respect you both for doing that. And I'll just add, again, since I'm offering up the perspective of someone who's not in ministry, I think the boundaries that we're all talking about are really good boundaries for any Christian single, whether you're in ministry or not, of, to your point, Vanessa, if things implode, even if you're not in ministry, protecting your own heart. And there's a reason that God has given us some of the guidelines and boundaries in his word. They are to protect us, even though they're challenging, but they're ultimately to protect us. But I think, I think it's interesting because for you guys who had some very built-in accountability there, if the church parking lot's right there, definitely some accountability. But I think also what I'm hearing from you is a little bit of that fishbowl experience of, if you walked out of the house and ran into someone from church, or getting a letter from a church member, and I will say, while I didn't have those experiences, I will say that the church, I think as a whole, was very welcoming when I started dating Eric. But I do think that adjusting to that fishbowl life was, it was tough and harder than I thought it was going to be. Because I grew up in the church and, I've been part of this church plant. And I think I came in with a false sense of understanding ministry, and until you're in it, you just can't, because you've never been there. And so I think that if speaking to those who might be single or dating and are in ministry, if you start dating someone who's not in ministry, I think you've got to give them a little bit of a sneak peek of understanding, hey, yes, those boundaries are for us, but they're more so for me because of the role I have. And you have to know, if you're going to date me, that this comes with it, is that there's a lot more of a magnifying glass. There's a lot more people watching. And you don't always know when or where or what they're going to say. And not that needs to define your actions, but it is something to be aware of so that you're not caught unawares or caught blindsided. And then kind of by the same token, to those who are in the church is, if your person on ministry staff starts dating and their significant other starts attending church, is by all means be welcoming to them. But I think offering, if you have the opportunity to offer them a safe place to wrestle with those things and to ask those questions and to process those and whatnot, get to know them, and not just on a, hey, you're dating Eric, right? But like on a, hey, Bethany, I want to get to know you. Those people become really powerful. And again, whether that relationship leads to marriage or not, that then provides a really great stable base for those people who are dating to feel secure and to feel okay and to feel like there's a safety net around them.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time for our conversation here. Thank you guys very much for being a part of this. For any of our viewers, if you have questions, we got a couple minutes left. Feel free to ask them, and we can pitch those to Eric and Vanessa. But I do have one other question for you guys to consider and maybe share with us. Now, having come through this, right, and being on a church staff, what encouragement would you guys give to those people who are in a church staff or who are in a team environment, maybe that's going to bring somebody in that is single and longing to date? How would you speak into that for them on the other side, to be considerate? And we touched on this even a little bit, but what are other thoughts maybe that come to mind?
I think, when you come across somebody that's single, I think encouraging them that it's okay to be single, that it's good to be single, and that in some ways you can serve God while you're single in ways that you can't when you're married. And there's some people that you can minister to as a single person that you can't as well when you're married. And then I think, as if somebody's dating or going through that process, I would really encourage being cautious, setting boundaries, putting yourself in a position to avoid a devastating pitfall, and something that could really be destructive, or someone else in the church or community looking to attack you, because of that. So I think encouraging caution in the process of dating.
I would say just being open to build relationships with couples, whether that's a person that's dating, have them over for a meal or invite them into situations so they don't have to be by themselves so much, into situations where they can maybe get to know the other person and you can get to know them. I think that's really important as church leadership, to build relationships with people so that you're a safe place for either that person that's on your staff to have difficult conversations with. And so it gives you a place to speak into their lives if maybe you do see some red flags or things like that. Without that relationship, you can't really speak any of that into somebody's life. And I think that period of dating, engagement, and even marriage is a really critical juncture in somebody's life. And having somebody that you can honestly have conversations with is really, really important.
Yeah, you guys, that's so good. And even Vanessa, just to call back some of what you were sharing a few minutes ago too, of being above reproach, and making sure that there are guidelines and things that are put in place to help protect them. And like you said, bringing in the key leaders and communicating with them and making sure that they're aware, so that when the church ladies come and ask those questions. Eric, I cannot believe that you had people ask you that at a business meeting. That blows my mind. But that then you're protected, right? That then people are prepared, where you're not the ones that have to speak to that as the single person or in the dating relationship, but that the key people on staff can speak to that. That, like you guys said, the elders can come to your defense because they know, and they're the needed people to know, rather than everyone, right? So really good stuff being shared there. Thank you guys for that. Thank you for joining us on this digital lab. Let's be honest, we're really only scratching the surface of this topic and this conversation. I'm sure we could spend many more hours telling stories and sharing of times where people thought they were helpful and maybe weren't as much. So thank you, Eric and Vanessa. To our viewers, thank you. If you found this conversation helpful, maybe you want to share this video. We'll put it out on YouTube.